Detective Sarah Chen had been watching Marcus Reed for 20 years, ever since that first night in 2003 when she worked security at one of his exclusive parties. Fresh out of the academy, she'd been hired as additional protection for what was supposed to be a simple networking event. But the moment she stepped into the mansion, she knew something was wrong. The cameras weren't just for security, they were positioned to capture compromising moments. The music was too loud, the drinks too strong, and the fear in some guests' eyes too real. When she tried to report her concerns, her supervisor laughed it off. "That's just how the industry works, rookie." But Chen couldn't let it go. She started carrying a small recording device, documenting conversations that made her skin crawl. Reed's voice echoed in her memory, "I decide who makes it and who disappears. Everyone here understands that." The weight of what she witnessed that night never left her. She'd seen young actors cornered in hallways, their eyes pleading for escape routes that didn't exist. She'd watched as Reed's inner circle systematically isolated vulnerable people, cutting them off from friends and allies. The mansion felt like a spider's web, and Reed sat at its center, pulling strings with calculated precision. Every smile was a threat, every handshake a transaction. Chen realized she wasn't just witnessing parties, she was documenting a criminal enterprise disguised as glamorous networking events. 20 years later, sitting in her car outside the courthouse, Chen clutched the box of evidence that had cost her everything: her job, her relationships, her peace of mind. The recordings had become her obsession and her burden. She'd watched Reed's empire grow while victims remained silent, protected by NDAs and fear. Today, finally, the truth would have its day, and the careful documentation of 2 decades would speak louder than money, influence, or intimidation. The courtroom was electric with tension as Chen took the witness stand. Marcus Reed, once the untouchable king of the entertainment empire, sat frozen as recognition dawned in his eyes. This wasn't just any witness, this was the security guard who'd asked too many questions, the one who'd mysteriously vanished from his inner circle decades ago. "Your Honor," Chen began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I have evidence spanning 2 decades that directly relates to the charges before this court." The prosecutor approached with boxes of recording devices, phones, jewelry with hidden cameras, sophisticated equipment that had evolved with technology over the years. Each piece represented a moment when Chen had chosen documentation over safety. Reed's attorney immediately objected, claiming the evidence was illegally obtained. But Chen was prepared. "In every instance, I was either in a public space or had legitimate reason to be present. I was protecting myself and preserving evidence of criminal activity." The gallery buzzed with whispers as Chen methodically explained her evidence collection. She'd learned to be invisible, blending into crowds while her devices captured conversations that revealed the true nature of Reed's operation. Reed's face had gone pale, his usual commanding presence replaced by something approaching panic. His legal team huddled frantically, realizing their carefully constructed defense was crumbling before testimony had even begun. The judge called for order as reporters scribbled notes, sensing that this case was about to expose something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Reed's empire, built on silence and fear, was about to face its greatest enemy: the truth, preserved in digital form and ready to speak. The first recording crackled through the courtroom speakers, Reed's voice unmistakable despite the background noise. "Nobody leaves until I say they leave. Nobody says no to me. Do you understand?" A frightened female voice responded, "Please, I just want to go home." "You'll go when I'm done with you. That's how this works." Chen explained the context: a party in 2003, a young model trying to leave, Reed security blocking the exits. The jury listened in horrified silence as more recordings played, each one revealing another layer of systematic control and intimidation. The audio quality improved over the years as Chen upgraded her equipment. By 2010, Reed's voice was crystal clear: "I own everybody in this room. I made you, and I can break you just as easily." The prosecution played recording after recording, creating a timeline of escalating abuse. Chen provided context for each piece of evidence, describing the sophisticated network Reed had built to maintain control. There were recordings of him instructing associates to handle problems, of him discussing victims by name and their weaknesses, of him bragging about his untouchable status. The jury heard him negotiate payment schedules for silence, discuss which judges and prosecutors were friendly, and plan elaborate schemes to discredit anyone who might speak against him. Each recording painted Reid not as an impulsive predator, but as a calculated architect of systematic abuse. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences, someone who viewed other human beings as assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. With each recording, Reid seemed to physically shrink. His usually immaculate appearance began to deteriorate, his tie loosened, his face flushed, his hands trembling as his own words condemned him from speakers throughout the courtroom. As the most damning recording played, Reid discussing plans to handle someone who had crossed him, his breathing became labored. The walls he'd built around his empire were crumbling, brick by brick, with each piece of evidence. "I've kept a lot inside for a long time," Chen testified, looking directly at Reid. "I've watched you destroy careers, silence victims, and build your kingdom on their suffering. Every recording in this room represents someone you hurt, someone whose voice you tried to steal." Reid's attorney desperately objected, claiming the recordings were taken out of context. But the pattern was undeniable: threats, intimidation, systematic abuse of power. The jury saw not individual incidents but a coordinated campaign of control. Chen explained her methodology, how she'd started with simple voice recorders hidden in her clothing, eventually upgrading to sophisticated surveillance equipment. "I wasn't planning to use these for prosecution initially. It was self-preservation. If something happened to me, there would be evidence." The prosecution revealed the scope of Chen's documentation. Thousands of hours of recordings, detailed notes, photographs, and financial records that showed how Reid had built and maintained his network of silence. She had documented payoffs to victims, threats to witnesses, and the systematic destruction of evidence. Her testimony revealed how Reid had corrupted legitimate businesses, turning talent agencies, production companies, and even security firms into instruments of his control. The courtroom learned about shell companies used to funnel hush money, about the network of accomplices who enabled his crimes, and about the careful legal strategies designed to protect him from consequences. Chen had become more than a witness, she had become a historian of systematic abuse, documenting not just crimes but an entire corrupt ecosystem. As a recording from 2016 played, Reid explicitly threatening a victim just weeks before a documented assault, he began to sway in his chair, the weight of 20 years of accumulated guilt finally crushing him. "Mr. Reid," Chen said, standing from the witness chair for her final statement, "you once told me that power meant having something on everyone around you. You were wrong. Real power is truth, and truth doesn't need to hide." She pulled out an old recording device from 2003, the first one she'd used. "I've carried this for 20 years as a reminder that someone was always watching, always listening. Your empire was built on silence, but silence has an expiration date." Reid tried to stand, his face ashen, his hands trembling. The courtroom held its breath as he swayed, then collapsed, his body unable to bear the weight of 2 decades of secrets finally exposed. As paramedics rushed in and chaos erupted, Chen remained calm. She'd waited 20 years for this moment, not for revenge, but for justice. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was the visible manifestation of an empire built on lies finally confronting truth. Reid's carefully constructed public image had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, recording by recording. The man who had wielded power through fear and intimidation had been brought down by his own words, preserved and presented by someone he had underestimated and forgotten. Walking out of the courthouse, Chen didn't look back at the fallen empire. She thought about the victims who would finally have their voices heard, about the young people who would no longer face the predatory system Reid had created. The recordings would continue to speak in courtrooms across the country as the full scope of his network was exposed. Other enablers would face justice, other victims would find courage to come forward, and the culture of silence that had protected Reid for decades would finally be broken. The king was dead. Long live the truth!